Hello, I'm Justin Clement. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn event hosted by the Valley Forge Park Alliance. We have a very entertaining talk today, a conversation with Robert Strauss, a biographer who has written John Marshall, The Final Founder. Now, this book, The Final Founder, it could be described as an unorthodox biography of John Marshall. Strauss views the study of history to include the word story in it. History should be lively and entertaining, in his opinion, not dull and turgid. He chooses biographical subjects representative of their era, and he hopes to tell stories around them that bring that period to life. Strauss also wrote the book Worst President Ever, a biography of James Buchanan, which won the gold medal for biography from the Independent Publishers Association, and Daddy's Little Goalie, a memoir about being the father of girl athletes. He has been a reporter for Sports Illustrated, a feature writer for the Philadelphia Daily News, and a news and sports producer for KYW-TV in Philadelphia. He was a nonfiction writing professor at the University of Pennsylvania for 20 years, and as a freelancer, he has more than 1,000 bylines in the New York Times. So Robert Strauss, a very accomplished journalist, very entertaining biographer, an excellent storyteller, and I hope that we'll have a very fun conversation today. So thank you for joining us, Robert Strauss. All right, so starting off, why don't we talk a little bit about John Marshall, his career at Valley Forge, as he was an officer in the Continental Army and present during the encampment.
Yeah, so Marshall got his commission more or less on his own. His father being friends with Washington, they got excited about the war, and Marshall becomes lieutenant because he has 10 or 20 guys under him, and he starts teaching them, and mostly he's an athlete growing up. That's what his father trained him to be, an athlete, and to a certain extent a soldier, but not really until the very end, before the war. So eventually Marshall gets to Valley Forge, and by this time he's still, so far as we know, a lieutenant, quote unquote, because that seems like the right level that he should be at, and not some higher level. And one of the things his mother sends to him often are white stockings, because she feels that they're like dignified for a soldier, that they would fit with the uniform. But a lot of people don't have them. But Marshall was this pretty good athlete. He was, the Bruce Jenner of Valley Forge, I guess, and then he runs very fast. And so he wins races that he makes, and so the guys call him Silver Heels because he's wearing white shoes, white stockings. So anyway, so he takes upon himself being sort of the rec director at Valley Forge. He has games, as you know, Washington liked his soldiers doing physical activities, and they did marching on occasion, but mostly they had to get out and about. If you were going to combat disease, you better be in good shape. So one of the diary entries that I saw was from some soldier, and he describes Marshall as being being able to jump over a stick or whatever, a pole, rather well. One of the heights this guy describes, is that there was a stick that was put on, like at each end on the head of a soldier, and Marshall could jump over it. So you can imagine it like he's like our first Olympian, it's the Valley Forge Olympics. And he does this for a while. And of course, his reason for doing this is one, to keep the troops happy. These are competitions that probably didn't mean very much. Well, they certainly didn't get you a higher station, but you might be pleased that you won. But also to to endear himself to these guys, because he wasn't taking them out and making a forced march, down the road and back up the road, and however they did it in Valley Forge. And he was having them do something fun. And he was a very popular guy in many of his fields. Now, of course, some of that was because he gave good parties, but in part of giving good parties is doing something like this. I can imagine, he did, he might have been the originator of pin the tail on the donkey. I don't know, but that kind of thing. He was, in his club in Richmond, he started this club, the Quoits Club. He became rather proficient at quoits. I don't know if people know what quoits is, but they're sort of round. It's like horseshoes, except that things are round and they go on the pole, or they get close to the pole, or whatever it is. So I don't know if he had quoits at Valley Forge, but it was the kind of thing that if you were looking back on Marshall and somebody told you this, if you knew him, you would say, "Oh yeah, that's what John would do. He would do something like that." And so that was his station at Valley Forge. Other than being really an acolyte of Washington, he just loved Washington. So anything he could do that, if Washington said, "Let's get the guys, doing something like this," then he would have done it in a second.
Yeah, and certainly Washington would encourage anything like that. As long as there wasn't any gambling involved. So, if there were races and placing bets, he would probably have a problem with, placing bets. And you do see that in the general orders. He's constantly repeating this emphasis that no games of chance were allowed. So one wonders if, there was a bit of money on the side, contrary to orders going on, and which is why they have to constantly reiterate, no gambling in camp. But yeah, so it's
maybe Marshall was the progenitor of Washington's orders.
Yeah, well, it's fun to think of this idea of John Marshall, one of these founding fathers, just organizing these different games that are going on. So yeah, that's a really great anecdote. Backing up just a moment, so Marshall was an officer during the American Revolution, correct? What was his rank?
Well, here's his rank. So when he comes out of, he lived in the far countryside, but really it's about 100 miles west of where Washington, D.C. is now. And he and his father, his father gets his commission because he was an old friend of Washington. And why not? They're going to get these, however many they're going to get. So he rounds up as many people from this town as he can to supervise. And he takes on the title of lieutenant. Now, who made him a lieutenant? I think he made himself a lieutenant. Who else was going to say it? It wasn't too high, so that it wasn't brigadier general, and he was skilled enough in athletics and knew how to shoot a gun and all this other stuff that he could supervise these other young people. I'm guessing that they were as young as 16 and maybe not quite old, 20 something, who were excited about going to the war. So he starts off as a lieutenant, much the same way as you would if you graduated the Naval Academy. I don't know what the technical rank is afterwards, but so that's about where he ends too. However official it was early in the war to make somebody something, that's sort of what he was. What I'm saying, I'm using Marshall. In my book, I have 7 or 8 little essays about American history that I think, Marshall, there was a chance that Marshall would have become president in the chaos of 1800. So I have a little essay about other people who might have been president, like Adlai Stevenson, Jefferson Davis, Henry Clay, William Jennings Bryan, people like that. Who were the worst Supreme Court justices? I could get into it, but that's the kind of thing that I like to write about. And one of them is like I say, how easy it was to be a founding father. So I'll tell you about how Marshall becomes this. So Marshall he has his service in the war, and before it's over, he's done. And his father's got some sort of, sinecure in Yorktown, Virginia. So he says, I don't know where to go. I'm going to go to Yorktown, right? So in Yorktown, of course, they haven't seen many men for a while. And this family, the Amblin family, has 3 teenage girls. Sounds a little bit like the Schuyler family, right? So I did say that if Lin-Manuel Miranda had found a biography of Marshall instead of Hamilton, he could have had the musical Marshall with 3 exclamation points. So anyway, Marshall comes and these girls say, wow, let's have a party, like for the new war hero coming to town. So they all dress up, and the youngest girl says, well, I'm going to get him, and the youngest girl's 13, Polly Amblin. So anyway,
terrifying.
Marshall comes to the door. Right, exactly. Really, you find that, Abigail Adams was 15 when she first went out with John Adams, and the Marquis de Lafayette's wife was 14. So this is sort of a running parallel there. But anyway, but Marshall comes to the door, and he's just like this Western Virginia hick. He's got a fringed jacket, much like John Voight in Midnight Cowboy. He's got a sort of a tilt hat that he made sort of decorative as a soldier. He's wearing boots. He sort of slouches. He's a little bit tall and gangly, and he's he's not particularly dignified in his speech. I mean, he doesn't curse or anything, but he doesn't use long words. And so then these girls are like, God, who did we invite here? It isn't Christopher Reeve. It's to go back to Midnight Cowboy, it's Dustin Hoffman. So anyway, but the young one still says, well, I'm still going to get it. And sure enough, Marshall is just smitten with her. So he says, I'm going to stay around, to his father. I'm going to stay around. Maybe I'll go over to this guy, George Witt, that cousin Tom went to study law. So he does. And he's at the Amblin house like every night. And so he starts studying with Witt, and his notebooks are there. These guys saved everything because they did have this premonition that they were doing something important and they should save things for posterity. So Marshall's law notes are scribbled around like a junior high girl. It's John Marshall and Polly Amblin, JM and PA, all through his little notes with his little girlfriend, right? He's in his 20s and she's 13, verging on 14. So anyway, her father, that's the other reason why he hates, Jefferson hates him. Her father married Jefferson's girlfriend. Jefferson had proposed to this woman. She rejected him and married the man who became Marshall's father-in-law. So anyway, but they go off to Richmond. He gets another job in Richmond. Richmond's sort of a schlep from Yorktown. But Marshall says, well, I think my work is done here. And he leaves law school and trots off to Richmond. At the time, Thomas Jefferson is friendly with him. He's the governor. He gives him his license to practice law. So he gets to Richmond, and it's sort of a desolate city. There's no sidewalks. There's no streets. There's the typical little running stream of fetid water going through the middle of the main street. What is the capital is virtually like an Amazon warehouse, just a big open space that somebody built. And eventually, Marshall becomes one of the prominent lawyer in Richmond in short order. And big deal. Richmond has 2,700 people. To be one of the best lawyers in Richmond, well, how many people could it be? So he then, even at a young age, he marries Polly. She's 15 when they finally get married. And he moves up in the chain. He gets in all the sort of right committees, and he gets elected from the places that have 700 people, like where he grew up, and he becomes a prominent person in Richmond. He had there are parties at his house all the time. He starts a thing called the Coits Club. He gets all sort of interested in quoits, and everybody joins, because what else is there to do if you're going? You have a bar. Well, let's have a quoits, whatever it is, arena. And anyway, he becomes a prime person. Decides he's a federalist. He decides the most important thing for the country is to stay together. That this group of states has got to stay together.
So, since you describe Marshall as having such a little formal schooling, would you categorize him somewhat as an autodidact, where he's learning on his own, probably scrolling through Blackstone's commentary and just getting a sense for English common law and so on? But did he have any mentors with on-the-job training?
Well, his father, of course, but one of the things, many houses had one or two books, mostly by Pope. He was sort of like the Harry Potter, I don't know, of his age. Everybody read Pope, but Washington and then his father were friends with Lord Fairfax, who was the only real British owner of a state, or whatever you want to call them, so who was sort of friendly with the American side. And Lord Fairfax opened his library to Marshall and Washington, and presumably others. And Marshall the Elder took advantage of it, and he took books home. So Marshall the Younger had many books to read growing up. And his father, I guess, was a little more schooled than the average surveyor, but he didn't go to school at all. But so, like many of the founders, like Washington didn't go to college either. They read a lot, and whatever they could. They were voracious readers and rereaders. Like, they memorized these books, like you would, I don't know, your golden books when you were 7 years old. When your mother would read to you at 5, you know all the words anyway. She didn't have to read it to you. So it wasn't so much an intellectual mentor, and that's what's marvelous about him and others, to become as educated as we seem to see them today. I mean, it wasn't that Jefferson did that a lot either.
It was a remarkable time period for that, and there's this one diary entry from a Hessian officer. He was a Jaeger, Captain Johann von Ewald. In his diary entry, he describes at one point when they're digging through the contents of an American officer who they had actually killed. They're kind of looting through his knapsack, and they find publications, like military treaties. And he's just remarking upon how just a few years earlier they were tailors and shoemakers and working at iron foundries, and that they were tradesmen that came from all walks of life, many of them lower class, but they were continually improving themselves throughout the war. And he was basically saying that they are becoming more formidable enemies. The Continental Army, the Army of the United States, they are becoming more formidable in many ways, as they become more veteran soldiers, but also because the officers, they were continually trying to improve their own education. So it's interesting that, this is from the military arts, but what you're describing is, someone who is improving himself and as an autodidact, someone who's educating himself as a legal scholar within the same time period. Yeah, or at least after the war.
Well, all these, and as you know, all these guys gave interminable speeches. When they're debating the whether to ratify the Constitution in Virginia, there's an incredible day after day, where Patrick Henry was really the great speaker. He said, no, give me liberty and give me death and all that. It's not so sure that's exactly what he said, but enough people would come to see him that they would all remember these particular parts. And so in the debates about whether Virginia should ratify the Constitution, Marshall took up the side of yes, and Patrick Henry had the side of no. And Patrick Henry was much more popular than John Marshall, I can tell you that. But somehow enough people were swayed by Marshall's arguments. Now, Virginia, we've gone in the nation from a Virginia-centric nation to a New York-centric nation to now a California-centric nation. You can debate whether California influences the rest of the country, but I would tell you it does. And New York did for a number of years, and to a certain extent now. But Virginia had 21% of the population of the United States in 1790. Because you got to remember, West Virginia was part of Virginia and Kentucky was part of Virginia at the time, until Kentucky broke off. So this was a huge amount. When you think about how many founders were from Virginia, I've just mentioned them: Washington, Madison, Monroe, Marshall, Patrick Henry, Jefferson. Well, anyway, lots and lots of them. So the influence of Virginia was great. It's said that Adams chose Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence because they needed a Virginian to be part of the group. It might not create its expected aura had not a Virginian written the document. So here we come now to the ratification of the Constitution, and it's said that once 9 states ratify it, then we're a country. Well, not if Virginia and New York don't do it. You know what I mean? So as Virginia's debating it, New Hampshire becomes the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. Well, good luck. And North Carolina hadn't passed it either, and the other 2 were New York and Rhode Island, and the same thing with New York. So New York is sort of waiting for Virginia to do it, and finally Marshall convinces the group to ratify it, but only by 10 votes. I forget the number, was 73 to 63, but somewhere in that range. So we barely became a country. We forget about these turnabout moments that make things different. I mean, you can say whatever battle changed World War II, or whatever battle changed the Civil War, or something like that. But here had a little whatever you want to call them, confederations of small states, or states that are New England would be one, and the South would be one. So it could have come out that way. It didn't. New York then ratifies it, and we wait around for North Carolina and Rhode Island, but they don't go. So it becomes even a greater figure as this orator. And that's another way they studied. In order to stand up there for 2 hours, you got to know something going on, right? So he moves up in that regard too, and that's a sense of where the revolution happens. It happens in all these places and all these things, and when people come to Philadelphia to decide on what becomes the Declaration, and then to decide on the Constitution, a lot of them have never been anywhere near Philadelphia. They've got to figure out how to, what they're going to do, and many of them, quit their jobs and had their own money to get there. But they board in these boarding houses. So in the morning and in the evening, they're eating together. And so you think about this, and they become sort of friendly. You know, Joe Schmo from Rhode Island and Jim, whatever his name is, from North Carolina. And so when it comes to compromising for the Constitution, all right, you know, Jim's a nice guy. You know, he's got to have something going on. He's told me about this, where he lives, it's different than where I live, you know, and I know that he'll give me this. So I can't tell you that that's exactly how it happened, but circumstances make me believe that that's the way it is, because they're living in this very small area of Philadelphia, you know, right around Independence Hall and a few blocks south and north and east and west. So that's sort of the way I believe happened, and Marshall is part of that in the sense that he influenced Virginia to do this. He eventually goes to Congress and becomes, you know, stays a good buddy of Washington. Washington offers him several jobs which he doesn't take: Attorney General and U.S. Attorney in Virginia. He just doesn't want to do it. He wants to go back sometimes to practice law, which he couldn't do if he had these jobs to make enough money to live on. And eventually, someone finds him a job that he wants, and that's Adams. He's gone to France and become a foreign affairs hero. He comes to Philadelphia, and there's a big parade for him. But Adams offers him the job of Secretary of State, because Adams finds that Hamilton has been meddling in the affairs of state that he doesn't want him to. He fires all 3/4 of his cabinet, and he places Marshall as Secretary of State. It's late in the term. He's still running for the 1800 presidential nomination, election against Jefferson. But Marshall then is sort of chief of staff. That's what Secretary of State is. And you know how many employees he had? 13. 13 people in the State Department. So they finally stepped down to Washington, because that's going to become the capital. But there's nothing there that Adams wants to be at. He hates the hot weather. He hates the humid weather. And there was one year he spent 7 months in Quincy, Massachusetts. Now, we complained about Obama's and Trump's golfing, or whatever, or George Bush going off to his ranch. 7 months in Quincy. It wasn't like he had even a telegraph. He certainly didn't have social media. He wrote letters running the government from Quincy. But anyway, at this point, he's down in Washington with Marshall, and he looks at Marshall. He says, "You know what? You supervise all this building." So he supervised the building of the White House and the Capitol and the Naval Building, and placing where they were. And he was in a rush. He was like the general contractor, like I said, because eventually Adams is going to come back, and we have to have it, like, you know, more or less done. So I say that he's probably the first person to sleep in the White House, because the taverns were so ill. Well, they weren't very nice. And he probably, once there was an enclosed area, he slept there. So he becomes, you know, one of Adams's favorite guys. And when the Supreme Court Chief Justice slot gets to an opening, and that's because Oliver Ellsworth is sent to France to negotiate a treaty with the pirates, and he gets stuck there because he's sick. And so he sends a note back, says, "I can't continue in the position." And Marshall comes to Adams with a list of people that he thinks are good, and Adams says, "No, I think it's going to be you." So at the same time, at the end of Adams's term, he is both Supreme Court Chief Justice and Secretary of State. So we look to the founding generation as, you know, something that sets the tone for us. Well, you know, it isn't as if John Roberts is going to be invited by Biden to the White House. He says, "You know, I got this other job for you too. You know, can you handle this, you know, like going off to Israel or something?" You know, so you know, that brings us to a crux in Marshall's life and the country. So yeah. I'll defer to you for another lead.
So I do say to the audience again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can address those as we go along. Now, the Supreme Court, it's interesting how of the three branches of the government, the judiciary branch was the one that was least outlined in the U.S. Constitution. And Marshall was just kind of this meteoric figure in terms of how he really thrust the judicial branch, forward as like this institution that had such a large impact on American society, and as a federalist too, right? Here's an individual long after the Federalist Party was dead.
Right,
Marshall
right.
is still around, with like his long reach of like Federalist policy, and then all his acolytes, who joined the Supreme Court as well as other justices are kind of trained under him. So it is amazing how much of an impact he had on legal history, and many monumental decisions that he penned early on as well. Yeah.
Right. Well, so he gets to this point, and I think what happened in his life is that now he's in his 40s and he's saying, I really got to do something substantial now. I've laid the groundwork in my life for all this stuff. And just like Washington set the tone for what presidents are. Whatever presidents are started with whatever Washington did, whatever he wore, how he stood this, how he excited debate. Not everybody loved Washington, but most people did. And similarly, that's how the court gets under Marshall. The court is an afterthought, as you say. John Jay, even as great a person as John Jay, is the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. So what happens? He goes off to negotiate a treaty with England. There's not, in the first session of the Supreme Court, there's one case, and that gets decided out of court. So it's not even like a thing almost. Marshall decides it's going to be a thing. And he has the justices around him, and he decides that this is how it's going to be. Every case is going to be a group decision. We're going to vote. Yes, we're going to vote. But when it comes out, we're going to be in one voice, because we don't have power in amongst ourselves unless we stay together. When they were in Washington, he would have them all stay at the same hotel so that they would have a conviviality and a knowledge of each other. So they were going to be buddies, both in the social and political realms. When they start out in Washington, they're in the basement of the Senate building, in a room that on Saturdays is often used for a town dance, and on Sundays is often used by some church. So it's really, even then, an afterthought. But Marshall has this vision that he's going to start, and he starts with a case called Marbury versus Madison.
Yes.
And it's a fun case, because here's how it starts. There's these things called the midnight judges, which you may know about from your schooling. At the very end, when it's seen that Jefferson is going to win, and it's in February, because Jefferson and Burr have been dueling for this title, Adams and the Federalists, they still control Congress. They control the executive still. So Adams appoints 43 federal judicial officials. Marshall, as Secretary of State, now he's already Supreme Court Chief Justice, but Marshall, as Secretary of State, has to sign off on these commissions. And it's getting late. In fact, it's getting so late that there's somebody from the Jefferson administration watching Marshall sign these to make sure he signs them by midnight on March 4th. So he does. He gets them then, and he sends them out, including his brothers, delivering them. And you got to remember that on that turn of the clock, the whole government becomes Republican. The two houses of Congress and the presidency are going to be Republican. Now, we worry about Joe Biden with this conservative Supreme Court 6-3. Well, on March 4th, as the Republican administration takes over, there are only Federalist judges. There's only been Federalist presidents, right? There's only been Federalist Congresses. So every judge in the federal system is a Federalist. Well, of course, Jefferson doesn't like it, and he's trying to figure out what to do. So they pass a Judiciary Act, and among the things is they don't have the Supreme Court meeting for another 19 months. They arrange the sessions so that they don't jive. But Marshall has already seen this case that he wants to deal with. And as you know, many of the Supreme Court cases, and probably state Supreme Courts too, it's not really about the facts. It's what you can prove in theory about that this allows you to do. So what Marshall wants, of course, is that the Supreme Court can rule on acts of Congress and say that they're invalid. Or what the Supreme Court does now. It's judicial review, it's called. So Marshall has this, then there's this guy, Bill Marbury, one of these people that's so important in our judicial system, but he was just sort of an operator. He was a guy who would take commissions. And that's how he would make his money. He got a commission to help find the site for the Naval Building in Washington. That's the kind of guy he was. I'm sure in every county there's somebody like this that it sort of gets these things. So the thing that he gets appointed to is a justice of the peace in Washington, D.C. But he does not receive his commission on time. And he's angry because he's been a Federalist, and now he sees the Federalists are going out of power. What's he going to get from the Republicans? By the way, as certain Republicans call when they speak about Democrats, they call it the Democrat Party. And of course, all the Democrats hate that because it's the Democratic Party. Well, the Jeffersonian Party often calls itself the Republican Democrats, but mostly the Republicans. But Marshall makes it a point to always call them the Democrats because that makes them sound close to the crazy people in France in the Revolution, who called themselves Democrats. So, Marshall was not above being a jerk sometimes. So anyway, but what he often did in these cases is he gave a sop to the other side, so that the other side would not bear upon him to change his other opinion. And Marshall's series of opinions that you talk about are all around the same thing. And that is that the judiciary can give its voice to any sort of federal versus state, state versus state, individual versus state, individual versus federal case. They all emanate from that, as does Marbury versus Madison. So when he decides Marbury versus Madison, he gives the Jeffersonians this sop that Marbury doesn't get his commission. The Secretary of State Madison has no, he can do whatever he wants. The commission came during his time. It didn't get delivered. He's Madison's employee. He can fire him or not fire him. But the review is whether this can even happen. And it's a convoluted review, and I won't get into it, but essentially, it strikes down the Judiciary Act of 1789, or parts of it, and proves that the court can do this, that the court can have judicial review. Now, let me remind you who didn't get Marbury's commission to him on time, but John Marshall. I mean, it's the landmark case of judicial history in the United States. And it's decided by somebody who, by any rights in any court today, would have to recuse himself, but he didn't, and there's Marbury versus Madison.
Yeah, the commission basically sat on the desk unsigned for quite a long period of time. But Yeah, so judicial review, to just emphasize this, the idea that the judiciary branch has the authority to overrule laws, that were passed by Congress, signed into the law by the executive branch. The judiciary can still overrule them. This is judiciary review in broad strokes. So, I mean, this is something that Marshall forged as a legal precedent, so that Marbury versus Madison, you can't overestimate just how critical this was in United States legal history.
Yeah, and like I say, it's sort of funny because if it happened today, it wouldn't happen, and it didn't happen in most countries in the world. Now it's based on English law, but English law is different. Parliament is different. But in all the other countries, from Russia to Netherlands to Spain, wherever, this didn't even exist. So we have in our country, even today, something that is different than other countries. And part of it, I would say, and one of my essays is, when did the founding end? And one of my friends wrote a biography of John Quincy Adams. So of course he says when John Quincy Adams dies, but I say that when Marbury versus Madison really made what most of the founders had thought of, at least, that three relatively equal branches of government. That's the point where our country becomes what our country is today.
Yeah,
more or less.
That's a fairly strong argument, really. And was this one of the reasons why you decided to title your book Final Founder and characterize Marshall as the final founder?
Well, he lasted the longest. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
I happen to have had a recent spinal surgery in the same building where he died in Philadelphia in 1805. So I'm now endeared to him that way, or he's endeared to me in that way. But it's just that he lasted so long, and he really was the only. Burr and Madison actually lived longer, but they were long in retirement. And he's still active. And as much as Jackson hated him for his decisions, he was still there, and he was still influential. And certainly all the younger justices revered him. All of them, and they were all Republicans by that time.
Yeah.
Or now Democrats, or whatever you want to call them, Jacksonians or Jeffersonians. So he was active and substantial.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. So does your book cover his John Marshall's life pretty much from his youth all the way through his legal career until he passed away?
Yes. One thing I say in the introduction is, if you're looking, forget about this phone call. I don't know who it is. It's probably one of John Marshall's descendants saying I said something wrong. But it's not. There are 600-page biographies of Marshall written 10 years ago or 15 years ago that will tell you every time he moved left or right. Mine, I do think, is a biography. It's not a kid's biography, but because it intersperses these essays that I want to have out there, that I like out there, and they somehow relate to Marshall, that's how I would say it is. It's a conversational biography, like you say, like we're having the conversation. You can have the conversation with the book.
Yeah.
My friends who are actors like it more because that's what they do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're not looking for every line in McCulloch versus Merwin. They're in there because they want to know, like Cohen's versus Virginia. Cohen's were obviously Jewish, and even though they're a part of this big law case, they weren't allowed to hold office, because they were Jews. And in Maryland and Virginia, they couldn't hold office. So it's sort of funny, and that's sort of the things that I like to emphasize, that these court cases, they're very important in our, everybody studies in the constitutional law who becomes a lawyer, they might not hold up in a county court the same way they did in the Supreme Court.
Well, we're at about time, but Robert Strauss, an excellent storyteller. So I do encourage everyone to check out his book. If you want to, look it up on Amazon. You can find it on Amazon.com. If you want to sponsor the Valley Forge Park Alliance, you can use the Amazon Smile app, the section on Amazon where you can sponsor a particular nonprofit organization while you're making a purchase. And Valley Forge Park Alliance is registered with Amazon Smile, so do check that out. And Robert Strauss, thank you very much for an entertaining conversation. We very much appreciate you being here today.
It's lovely. I've always loved doing this kind of thing. And I didn't know about this Amazon sponsorship, but all you people out there should do that.
All right. All right. Well, take care, sir. And to everyone else, stay safe. Enjoy yourselves at the park and have a good afternoon. Take care.